think we'll get starting.
Yep, up to you.
Sure. So a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on which part of the world you are in. Welcome to the webinar series on everything you need to know about racism in Australia, brought to you by the Asian Australian Alliance. My name is Thomson Ching, and I'm the New South Wales convener for the Asian Australian Alliance, and I'm your host for the day. Now, according to the fact sheets by the Australian Human Rights Commission, there are 1 in 5 Australians who say that they have experienced verbal abuse or name calling. And more than 1 in 20 Australians say that they have been physically attacked. Joining us today is Erin Chu, the National Convener of the Asian Australian Alliance and the Coordinator for the COVID-19 Racism Incident Report. Molina Asthana, the Victorian Convener for the Asian Australian Alliance and the Vice President for the Asian Australian Lawyers Association. Lynette Burns, the Managers for Inquiries and Conciliations, Anti-Discrimination New South Wales and Department of Communities and Justice. Lena Nahlous, the Executive Director of Diversity Arts Australia, DARTS. And a little bit later today, we'll be joined by also Tim Lowe-Sudo, who is the founder and National Director of Democracy in Colour. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to quickly get everyone on the panel today to quickly introduce yourself and tell us briefly, what does your organization do? I'll start with Erin.
Yeah. Oh, hi, everybody. So my name's Erin Chu. I'm the co-founder and national convener for the Asian Australian Alliance, which is basically an advocacy network advocating on common issues among the Asian Australian community. So I guess our most visible and most current work that we're working together with our partners, Diversity Arts Australia and Democracy in Colour, is our COVID-19 Racism Incident Report Survey. So yeah, that's just my brief introduction.
Okay, and now over to Molina.
Hi everyone, my name is Molina, as have been introduced. I'm the Victorian convener of the Asian Australian Alliance. You've heard a little bit about what we do from Erin. I'm also the National Vice President of the Asian Australian Lawyers Association, which works for greater diversity for Asian lawyers in the high echelons of the legal profession. So I'm looking forward to today's seminar.
Thank you. And I'll get Lena to introduce herself. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Lena Nahlous, and I'm the Executive Director of Diversity Arts Australia. We are an organisation that advocates for equity and inclusion, particularly racial equity in the arts and creative sector, including screen and film, for people, then that's our focus, working on racial equity and inclusion for people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, migrant and refugee backgrounds. And we also do work with some overseas students through our programs like Storycasters. And our focus is on research, on advocacy, on developing specific projects, on, I guess, extending the conversation. And yeah, it's a bit about what we do.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Look, I just thought we just kickstart our Q&A today, and I will get Erin to start with the question on if you are able to give us a little bit about the history of racism in Australia, and also, you know, the survey report on the COVID-19 racism incident that you are also part of, you know, the coordinating. And also a little bit more about the roles of different stakeholders.
Okay, cool. So I'll first start off with just giving a little bit of history. And if people have questions, please feel free to type it into the chat section, and our admin, Adri, will pass it on to Thomson. So questions anytime or comments, just put it in there. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And I know we got quite a decent group, so I'll get started. So I just wanted to start, before I talk about history, I just want to say that the COVID-19 related racism is not the cause of racism in Australia, more like it's a symptom of a bigger issue of racism in Australia. And this is something that Australia has not had a decent conversation over when we talk about racism. And the other thing I want to say is that racism works in cycles. So right now, yes, you know, people of Asian appearance in Australia are the targets of racism, but it goes in cycles. So later on, it'll be African Australians, later on it'll be Indigenous Australians, another time will be Middle Eastern or Muslim Australians. So it goes in a cycle. So one thing we need to remember is that it's not one community that's targeted, it's a cycle. So one thing we also, like I said, you know, when COVID-19 related racism is not the cause, racism in Australia, actually, you know, when we talk about Asian Australians, really started back in the 1800s during the gold rush period when the Chinese actually first came to Australia. And, you know, and that's when, you know, the ideas of, you know, Chinaman or yellow peril became a term that's still kind of used today. Later on, you know, in the kind of late 1800s, and beginning of 1900s, when Australia became a federation, Australia instituted the Government Immigration Restrictions Act 1901, which we know better as the White Australia policy. And that actually started, and they put that in because they wanted to reduce the number of Chinese people who are actually in Australia. That ended in 1973, and then in 1975 we saw that there's a bipartisanship between Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser, at that time Prime Minister, and the opposition, who enacted the Racial Discrimination Act 1975, and then that was set in stone. Other kind of highlights that we need to remind ourselves on is the idea of, you know, Hansenism. So when One Nation and Pauline Hanson came in, and in her maiden speech, she did say stuff like, you know, Australia is swamped by Asians, which is one of her famous words, you know, during her maiden speech. And there was also a lot of racism towards the Vietnamese Australian community in that time, in that 90s period, mid to late 90s, particularly that idea that all Vietnamese people were in gangs and were in crime and things, and in drugs and things like that. So there was a lot of racism towards Vietnamese Australians in that time as well. And then later on, you know, we saw other cycles of racism towards Indian students, particularly those who are in taxi drivers and things like that. And then more recently, in the last couple of years, you know, there has been a lot of xenophobia on how the debate and the discussion around the growing influence of China in Australia is going. And then obviously now we talk about the COVID-19 racism. So I think the second part I'll go in, because I know we don't have too much time, is talking a little bit about our survey, and then I'll talk about some of the different roles of the stakeholders. So in terms of the terms of the survey, you know, we launched it on April 2nd. So now we're in 1st of May. So it's been about a month. And in terms of reports, we have around 307 as of right now, 307 reports of COVID-19 racism, and about 85 to 90% of respondents said that they felt that the racism that they've experienced was a result of COVID-19 racism. And the reason why we started the survey was really to provide a platform for Asian Australians to share their experience, because being a victim of racism is a very jarring and a very traumatic experience. And a lot of people are wondering, what can they do? You know, a lot of people have told me that they're not going to report it to police because they didn't feel it was serious enough. So providing this mechanism was a way that they can actually share their experience. And a lot of this work was actually inspired by the work a lot of Asian American groups have done in terms of launching surveys and trackers to track the amount of racism that is happening. Another few more key statistics I want to highlight is that the majority of respondents are female, so it's around about over 65%. over the majority of the types of racism are people, giving out racial slurs. So, being blamed for the coronavirus, being called a chink, being called ching chong, and all the usual racial slurs, being Asian and being Asian Australian that we're used to hearing. And so that was around about over 44%, which is which was the highest number. Where it is happening, usually on a public street or sidewalk. So almost half, so about 50% stated that the racism that they received was, on the public street or sidewalk when they're taking a walk. One of the stories, and obviously keeping names out, that really struck me the most was a guy there was a person who reported that his elderly mother was taking a walk on the sidewalk, and the person who was the perpetrator of racism blocked her path and just started yelling at her, so wouldn't let her cross. And then took about 2 minutes until bystanders came and moved that person. And his mother started to cry because she didn't understand what was going on, but she knew that it was racism. And because of her limited English skills, she couldn't confront them. So these are the type of stories that we are hearing. Other types of statistics that are notable is that around about 15 to 16% of those who have reported said that they're international students. Now, that statistic could be more. And the reason why I say that is because, thanks to Thomson, who gave us a prompt reminder that that question should be put in. So we did put that question in about 2 weeks ago, or maybe a little bit more than that. So I know going through, now we're starting to go through the longer responses, and a lot of people do indicate that there are international students, so that statistic could grow a lot more. In terms of state-wise, New South Wales produced the highest amount, and that was about 35%. And then second to that is Victoria. And I guess there's not really any surprises there, considering, a lot of the stuff we've seen, online, even on the media that's been covered, are, from those two states. So that's just a quick rundown of some of the key statistics. And we are producing so far we're slowly, some of our team members are analyzing the results, and we will be putting that into a preliminary report. So the survey/tracker, whichever way you want to call it, we're going to be opening that up indefinitely. We do encourage everybody to actually fill it in if you have experienced any types of racism. Doesn't matter whether you're an Australian citizen, you're a migrant, you're a PR, you're on a working visa, or you're an international student. It's open for all. And we also have it translated into Chinese and Korean as well, so that there is a lot more accessibility in that sense. Now, I'll quickly go through the roles of different stakeholders. I know there's a lot to kind of get into, so if you guys have questions, just let us know. So when we talk about the stakeholders in this whole world of, racism and the process of racism in Australia, we need to look at as there's like legal stakeholders. There's also boards and committees. There's community groups / organizations. There's advocacy groups, and there's also mental health orgs and individuals as well. And there could be more stakeholders, but these are just general. So if I have missed any, if the other speakers know that I've missed something, then add it in, or else, as a participant, you guys can also kind of just type it in if we forget anything. But I'm not going to go into great detail because I know we have actual, lawyers and experts to go into a lot more detail. But just in brief, when we talk about the legal stakeholders, there is federal, state and territory laws in Australia which protect people from discrimination and harassment. So on a federal level, things are slightly different to a state level, and in different states, which you'll learn a little bit later on, from Lynette from New South Wales Anti-Discrimination, and from Molina, who will talk a little bit about the Victorian and the federal system, they're all slightly different. So the Australian Human Rights Commission has actually statutory responsibilities under Age Discrimination Act of 2004, Australian Human Rights Commission Act 1986, Disability Discrimination Act 1992, and what is most relevant for us is the Racial Discrimination Act 1975, which I mentioned at the beginning in the history, which was that bipartisanship between Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser, and also the Sex Discrimination Act 1984. So these are all the acts that pretty much the Human Rights Commission, which is more on a federal level, has that responsibility over. And so when we talk about race discrimination, our current race discrimination commissioner is Chin Tan, and you guys probably would have seen him in some media articles and things like that, talking about COVID-19 related racism. The former, as you know, people would recognize, was Dr. Tim Sithomasan, and he's still currently, he's working at University of Sydney. You know, can't remember what role he's working at, someone can correct me later on. But, you know, he's still very vocal talking about COVID-19 related racism. So like I said, in addition to the federal legislation, so what the Human Rights Commission looks over, each state and territory has its own, and it either comes under anti-discrimination agencies, like in New South Wales, or equal opportunities. I think it's Equal Opportunities Commission, Molina, if I'm correct or incorrect. And they also have their own statutory responsibilities, which means that each state has its own type of legislation in terms of anti-discrimination that they kind of look over. So that's just a very brief, and I guess the others will kind of go into a bit more detail. And so Molina, like I said, will talk about the federal and the Victoria, whilst Lynette from Anti-Discrimination New South Wales will talk about the New South Wales legislation. So other key stakeholders, because I know time is precious here, the police. So the police and law enforcement are a huge stakeholder. And we need to understand that in a lot of the state police headquarters, they either have civilian workers or actual police officers whose actual role is just to engage with different cold communities. So all different types of communities. And their role is to reach out and to ensure that people understand what the role of the police is in each state. So each state has a slightly different, but for example, you know, I've been in conversation with the community engagement senior constable Sam Lim, and he's from Perth, for example. So there's also various units in the police. So I know, for example, in New South Wales, they have a hate crimes unit where their job is to deal with crimes where race was a motivation in terms for the crimes. And I'll be very quick with the last few points. There's also other boards and committees. So when we talk about federal, you know, we know that there are ministers, there's shadow ministers for multiculturalism. And then in the departments such as Home Affairs Department, Community Services, and things like that, they have positions or roles for people whose role is to engage with the community. And then there's also boards that are nominated positions or appointed from people from the community to kind of give that advice to various ministers on state and federal levels as well. So the last few things I'll quickly go through is that there's also community groups and organizations. So if you guys need that support, you know, Google up some of the community groups and organizations, multicultural groups, and they can also give you that advice. If they can't deal with it, they'll tell you who can actually, you know, help you in that sense. And like us, Asian Australian Alliance, Democracy in Colour, Diversity Arts Australia, we're all like advocacy groups So, you know, stuff that we're doing with, you know, campaigns on racism, campaigns with this survey and things like that. And finally, there's mental health professionals and organizations. And I want to end by saying that it's being a victim of racism is actually really traumatic for many people. It doesn't matter the severity, but it is very traumatic. So if you do feel that you need to, feel free to reach out to places like Beyond Blue or the, you know, multicultural mental health group and Headspace and things like that. So unless there's questions later on, I think that's the, you know, you guys can have the liberty of not hearing me talk for a little while. Thank you, Thomson.
Thank you so much, Erin. And we also have a quick comment from Jane Anderson from TAFE New South Wales that the correct title for Professor Tim's former son is the Director of Cultural Strategy at the University of Sydney.
Thank you.
Look, as we're talking about race dynamics, I should also acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where we are joining the Zoom call today. And as the traditional custodians of the land, I would like to pay respects to the elders past and present, and certainly welcome any Indigenous people who are joining us today. So without further ado, I'll just quickly move to Molina. So if Molina, if I can get you to share a little bit more about the federal and state acts, particularly on the differences of the two.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin, for that very comprehensive overview on what does constitute racial discrimination and all the stakeholders we're working with. I just wanted to quickly add that we are also working with universities and student groups that are really, really important because we have a huge Asian population of students here in Australia as well. So I will move to the Racial Discrimination Act, which is the federal act that deals with racism. So the Racial Discrimination Act promotes equality between people of different backgrounds, and it protects people from unfair treatment or vilification on the basis of their race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin. Racial discrimination occurs under the RDA when someone is treated less fairly than someone else in a similar situation because of their race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin. Racial discrimination can also occur when a policy or rule appears to treat everyone in the same way, but actually has an unfair effect on more people of a particular race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin than others. So it is also against the law to discriminate in areas such as employment, land. So if you're going out renting or buying a property, housing, accommodation, provision of goods and services, access to places and facilities for use by the public, even transportation, advertising, or joining a trade union. But of particular importance is section 18C of the Act, which makes it unlawful for a person to do an act in public if it is reasonably likely to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate a person of a certain race, color, or national or ethnic origin. And the act was done because of one or more of these characteristics. This is the vilification section, basically, in which anyone who's going through racial discrimination, facing discrimination because of COVID, can rely on if they do go and complain to the commission. However, there are some exceptions provided in section 18D, including acts relating to artistic works, genuine academic or scientific purposes, fair reporting, and fair comment on matters of public interest. So in contrast, the act in Victoria, which is the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act 2001, basically deals with vilification. It does not talk about opportunities and the lack of opportunities because of discrimination, which is dealt in the Federal Act. It deals mainly with vilification. So it prohibits behavior that incites or encourages hatred, serious contempt, revulsion, or severe ridicule against another person or group of people because of their race or religion. It makes both racial and religious vilification unlawful. Vilifying conduct is contrary to democratic values, as we know, because of its effect on people who, as a result of being vilified, feel isolated from the community and are less likely to participate in community activities. So it does deal with access, but more in terms of vilification. So behavior that can be seen as racial or religious vilification includes speaking about a person's race or religion in a way that would make other people hate or ridicule that person. Publishing claims that a racial or religious group is involved in serious crimes without any proof. Repeated and serious offense. This has happened with profiling of Africans in Victoria. This was a serious issue here. Then repeated and serious spoken or physical abuse because of the race or religion of another person. Encouraging violence against people who belong to a particular race or religion, or damaging their property, which has also happened. We've seen in the media how this has happened during COVID-19. Encouraging people to hate a racial or religious group using flyers, stickers, posters, speech or publication, or using websites or email. It is also against this law to give permission or help someone to vilify others. So it therefore prohibits victimization as well. So this is what the Victorian Act is. I'm not an expert on New South Wales, so I won't talk about it. And there's another speaker who will be talking about that. So if you do have a complaint, you can go to the Australian Human Rights Commission under the RDA. And you can fill in an online form, and the Commission will use the information you provide to assess, investigate, and or conciliate your complaint. So the Commission only has the right to, the authority to conciliate. It will collect the information, investigate, and then conciliate between the parties. And most of the cases are settled by conciliation, but there may be some that won't. And those may be serious matters. You can go to the federal court if you want to challenge that decision by the Human Rights Commission. That's the only other avenue. With the Victorian Act, you can go to the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission, which administers the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. So if you think you've been discriminated against, victimized, or vilified, you can contact them. It's fairly easy to contact them. You can send them an email. There's an online chat function as well on their website that you can use to refer a complaint or someone else's complaint as well. They also resolve these matters through conciliation. Their dispute resolution service is free and confidential. They also have a community reporting tool, which is an online form that makes it easier for you to tell the Commission what has happened confidentially. You can complain about someone else as well on it without leaving your details if you are worried about that. Many complaints are resolved at conciliation, and outcomes may include an apology, verbal or written, private or more public, financial compensation, a job reinstatement or reference, access to a previously denied job opportunity or service, agreement to change or stop behavior, an agreement to amend or develop policies, an agreement to undertake human resources and equal opportunity training. In some of the serious cases of vilification, you can also go to the VCAT, Victorian, the tribunal in Victoria as well. So these are some of so as I mentioned, the main difference between the two acts is that the Victorian Act mainly deals with vilification, and the opportunity part of it is dealt in a separate act, whereas the Federal Act deals with both. So hopefully that gives you some insight. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them later in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Molina. So I'll go over to Lynette Burns, who is from the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Department of Community and Justice. So Lynette, if you are able to quickly share with us the role of the Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, and also perhaps a little bit of the statistic that has been reported to the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board, and if there are any specific cases about international students. Over to you, Lynette.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks. Very interesting to listen to the other speakers. The previous speaker roughly covered the sort of anti-discrimination law in New South Wales. well, she covered Victorian and the federal acts, which are pretty similar to the New South Wales Act. In terms of the sorts of behaviours that we cover and the sorts of things that you can make a complaint about, I think it's important to point out that in New South Wales and pretty much in every jurisdiction that it's an individual complaint-based situation. So we get quite a lot of inquiries from people who ask what we're doing about particular things without actually making an individual complaint. Of course, we follow those people up and we ask them if they want to make an individual complaint, because that's basically how we can take action. We can't unilaterally take action. So in terms of the types of the numbers of complaints that we get, last financial year, 14% of our complaints were racial discrimination complaints. So that was in the order of 149 complaints. So it's not the biggest section. The biggest number of complaints we get is in the disability discrimination area, but we roughly cover the same kind of things like discrimination in employment, receiving goods and service, accommodation, registered clubs, that kind of thing. At the moment, New South Wales Anti-Discrimination is particularly interested in the COVID-19 situation. As previous speakers have pointed out, that has led to an increase, a spike in racial attacks against people, particularly, I guess, Asian Australians, and that's certainly reflected in the kinds of inquiries and complaints that we get. Sadly, we can't cover all of them because quite a few of the complaints and inquiries, and I'm the person who looks at them first and assesses them, are pretty horrific acts where people have been spat on, called horrible names, assaulted physically, and had their property damaged, as referred to before. Now, one of the problems with that is the person doesn't usually know the name of the person who's assaulted them or committed those acts. So without a name, without a respondent, there's nothing that we can do about those kinds of things, except, of course, raise them generally. And some of the acts, as the previous speaker pointed out, are acts that can be referred to the police because under racial vilification legislation. So we are seeing things like people being asked to leave accommodation because of their racial background. Now, that also would be covered by our Act. There have been some reports of refusal of goods and services. That would also be covered. We've seen some employment complaints as well. You have to keep in mind that in order to have a valid complaint, you have to prove that, or have to at least allege and have some evidence that the unfair treatment that you received was on the grounds of your race or whatever other ground that we cover, for example, disability. So you really have to show that the treatment you had was different to treatment to people who don't have that characteristic. So sometimes that's a little bit hard to get your head around. So we covered direct discrimination, so that's pretty obvious when someone does it directly, but also indirect discrimination. So that might not be that obvious at first. It might be something that affects you more significantly because of whatever characteristic you're complaining that you've been unfairly treated on. So, you know, if it's race, whatever the treatment is, it affects you more seriously because of your racial background. So that's roughly the sorts of things that we cover and the sorts of things that we've seen in the COVID-19 situation. And as I said, there has been an increase in the complaints. The previous speaker covered the kinds of outcomes that can happen. We're also it's a conciliation-based procedure. So we can't make a determination about whether racism has or hasn't occurred. All we can do is get the parties together and try and have the matter conciliated. So the sorts of outcomes that people might get would be an apology. They might be allowed to stay in their accommodation. We've certainly had outcomes like that. They might get whoever has refused the goods and services may well back down and provide the goods and services, things like that. Those are the kinds of outcomes. The difference with New South Wales is that if it's not conciliated, if it can't be resolved, then we do have the opportunity for it to go to the tribunal, to the Civil and Administrative Tribunal, where they can actually make a determination. So that's quite a bit different to the federal sphere, where you have to actually go to the federal court. They don't have a tribunal. So it's kind of roughly what New South Wales anti-discrimination covers and the kinds of outcomes you can expect.
Okay. I just wanted to talk a little bit more, Lynette, if in the, direct and indirect discriminations, and I'll bring in Lena as well a little bit later on this particular topic. I just want to get your thought about, because I think it's very interesting for people to be able to identify if this is racism and whether it is direct racism or indirect racism, and how do they take that forward. So I think, how do people actually know if it is a direct or an indirect racism, or if it is not racism?
Yeah, that's pretty difficult at times. I mean, the direct ones are usually obvious, but sometimes they're not that obvious. For example, you might say, well, look, I've been sacked from work because there's a downturn because of COVID. And that might sound very unfair, but if it isn't based on your race, as in you haven't been particularly singled out, other people not of your particular race have also been sacked or given fewer shifts, then it's going to be pretty hard for you to show that that's because of your race, because of the ground that's covered by the Act. There might be other instances where, so really the sorts of things you're looking for with indirect discrimination are whatever's been asked of me is harder for someone of my racial background or whatever the ground is, harder for me to comply with than the rest of the population. So it's kind of hard to think of something off the top of my head in terms of the COVID-19 situation, for example. I mean, the classic one that I used to work in disability discrimination, and the classic one that used to be really obvious in disability discrimination was if you were asked to have an ID for, just for the purposes, asked to produce a driver's license for the purpose of identification, and it's usually harder for someone with a disability to have a driver's license than someone without a disability. And you can have other forms of ID. For example, you could have a passport or something like that that would be acceptable for an ID. So you have to think in terms of, in those kinds of terms, what is it that I'm being asked to do or I'm being denied that impacts more harshly on me than it would on someone without my characteristic.
Okay, thank you so much, Lynette. I'll move on to Lena. Okay, so Lena, in your experience, right? So we just want to talk a little bit more about direct and indirect discrimination. So in your experience, how do people actually know that? How do they identify that? And perhaps you can share a little bit from, a Diversity Arts Australia's organisation perspective, particularly with the, COVID-19 racism incident that has been going for, as we can see in media reports. So over to you, Lena.
I have to take a few minutes to process and think of a COVID example.
Sure.
My children, who are both Arab and Chinese, reported to me both separately. They're 8 and 9 years old. Incidences
Right.
at their school where Chinese children and Asian children weren't allowed to play with other children because of the colour of their hair. I would say that was direct discrimination.
Wow.
I would, and I reported it to the school who done absolutely nothing, but which is often the case, I think, very sadly. But I thought of examples. I used to work many years ago at the Arab Council, and I worked with young people in an area that had a really big Muslim populations. And the local regional swimming carnival was organised during Ramadan, and it's Ramadan now. And what's really interesting, for people who don't know, is during Ramadan, you're not supposed to have water go into your mouth. And also, if you're fasting all day, you're pretty tired. Going into a regional swimming carnival is not something that you're going to necessarily have the stamina to do. And so this swimming carnival was actually organised during Ramadan. So I would call that indirect discrimination, where people aren't able to participate on the basis of their ethnicity or religion, because something's been set up in a way, a structure's been set up to exclude them. And then I had another example of the young women I worked with who wore hijab and were told they weren't allowed to play soccer while they were wearing hijab. So that's direct discrimination, I guess. Maybe other people have a better example of indirect. I guess indirect discrimination related to COVID would be either Asians living in Australia or Asian Australians being, not getting accommodation, or and not being told that it was because of their, that they were Asian. Or I'm trying to think of other indirect discriminations that maybe are where things are not. Would you say, Molina and Lynette, that the constant equating the COVID-19 with Asian people would be a form of indirect discrimination, where it's almost like calling it an Asian virus or a Chinese virus is definitely creating is creating more kind of racial discrimination for people, but it's not a direct thing. I would like to hear what they have to say about that, if it's indirect or direct.
Yeah. Well,
because I think the media has gotten away with a lot in this as well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess if someone's saying something is because of being Asian Australian, then it's pretty direct. I suppose what you're referring to is like the sort of stuff that you see on social media and just generally, which is kind of setting the scene for it to be, to allow discrimination to happen more readily and more easily, which is something that, for example, our community development people would look at. I'm in the inquiries and conciliation. So as I said, it does rely on you basically making a complaint on behalf of yourself or legitimately on behalf of a group of people. The thing about indirect is it is often really hard to call out and to find. I mean, I think with what we've observed with the COVID-19 stuff is it's actually pretty direct. So, people are being told pretty straight up, we don't want you, we don't want to give you this accommodation. We don't want to rent this flat out to you because you're more likely to be having the COVID virus, or you're responsible for it, or something like that. So it seems to be pretty straightforward for a lot of the cases. Yeah, I think often it's pretty hard to kind of find the direct and the indirect until it actually happens.
It's very interesting, Lynette, you mentioned that, because I think with whether it is direct or indirect discrimination, one of the key things we have to know is that sometimes even people who are actually doing that themselves, they did not realize that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So,
and that's the unconscious bias aspect of that, and which I was going to come to as well, which may be termed as indirect discrimination, and although it's harder to prove that because it's the stereotyping and it's those biases that everyone has in their heads about certain communities or certain religions or certain people of racial groups. So there's some people in the group chat have come up with some examples as well of employer. People can go through that, and they are good examples of indirect discrimination as well.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. They're fantastic.
Yeah,
I think the thing about discrimination is that it's unfair treatment. So that's the initial thing. You think, that just doesn't seem fair. So, that's why we have an inquiry service, so you can actually ring up and have a discussion with someone who, has a pretty good knowledge of discrimination. I mean, we don't give legal advice, but we certainly refer people for legal advice. So if there is something about it that, you're just not sure about, you can actually get some legal advice and see whether you have got a complaint of discrimination. And they, of course, very versed in indirect and as well as direct discrimination.
thank you. Look, I'll bring in Tim Lucido from the Democracy in Color to the conversations, and Tim has just joined us. So thank you, Tim. I'll just ask you a couple of questions, but if you can quickly start by telling us a little bit more about what the organization does and perhaps in the more broader community efforts in addressing racism, or particularly related to the COVID-19, and also what are the strategies to address racial discrimination? Over to you, Tim.
Sure. Thanks, folks. My name is Tim. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, but wherever we all are around this country, it's all stolen land and sovereignty was never ceded. So I work at Democracy in Colour. It's a racial and economic justice organisation led by people of colour. We do political advocacy around anti-racism and economic fairness. And then the second piece of work we do is training and leadership development work designed to strengthen the political voice of people of colour. I might very quickly, or try to quickly, talk about our COVID-19 response before potentially getting to some of those other questions. So our response is sort of in four areas, three main ones. The first one is tackling the racialized narrative around COVID-19, which you've all just had a great discussion on, so I'm not going to get into that. The second one is around campaigning to expand the wage subsidy, so JobKeeper and JobSeeker, to temporary visa holders, to international students, undocumented workers, and people seeking asylum and refugees. So as we probably all know, and probably a number of us on this call are experiencing right now, is that temporary migrant workers have been excluded. You know, some 1.1 million people in this country have been excluded from essential life-saving support to get us through a global pandemic. And this is a big problem for a number of reasons. So migrants work in essential services. Migrants basically power this country, right? Like, what migrants work in essential services to pick and pack the food that we eat. Farms, abattoirs, factories, they are essential in cleaning. They clean our spaces. They're essential in construction, in security. And you want to talk about, you know, undocumented migrant workers. They do some of the most dangerous, low-paid work in this country. And so over the last few decades, we've seen this country build a migration system that's been reliant on the exploitation of an impoverished underclass of migrant workers. And so their work is not valued. They earn poverty wages. They work in exploitative conditions, and they're not offered workplace benefits. So it's in this context that it's even more outrageous that we're in a global pandemic, and you have some of the most vulnerable workers that this country has exploited for decades to build quite a great mass of wealth. And when it comes to a health crisis, this country is prepared to wash its hands of these people. So it's particularly egregious from a fairness lens, but it's also like egregious because the fact that these people, these communities, are at higher risk of exposure to the virus because of the industries they work in, and they're also more likely to be forced to work because they are in industries that have very depressed wages. You can't physically distance if you can't pay rent, if you can't put food on the table. You're just going to be forced to work anyway, even when you are sick. So it's the whole approach that this country has taken, the Morrison government has taken to viciously excluding these people from essential life-saving support is absolutely ridiculous. It's stupid, it's short-sighted, it's myopic, and it's racist. So that's the first area of work we're doing. The second area of campaigning is where we're trying to campaign to establish an information firewall between health professionals and the Department of Home Affairs, in particular for undocumented migrant workers. So as many of us on this call would probably know, if you're an undocumented worker, i.e. if you're in this country without a visa, or not an appropriate visa, and if you presented at a hospital to seek treatment, you're at risk of having your visa checked and then potentially being detained or deported. And whilst we're in this moment in COVID-19, it basically means you'll just be indefinitely detained because borders are closed and flights have been shut. And so, like, that is not a good situation to be in a health crisis, because it creates a positive disincentive for people to go out and try and seek medical attention. So we want to try and establish that all people have access to healthcare, and they can do so free of the fear of being detained or deported. And then the sort of last area of our work is we're doing a whole bunch of mutual aid work in collaboration with some of the organisations on this call, like Diversity Arts Australia and the Asian Australian Alliance, and a whole bunch of others. So that is, in a not so brief nutshell, what we're doing around COVID. Was there some other area you'd like me to talk to?
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you so much, Tim. Look, we might just jump straight to the Q&A, and we certainly have received a couple of questions that people send in via email, but of course there are also many questions. I can see the enthusiasm in our audience today. So I'll start by the question by Rati Ramanathan. And Rati's question is particularly on the support of independent incorporated advocacy groups like Lotus. Lotus, for the information of others, is the language other than English. Together with us is a community organizations. So the question is, based on consistent findings from the Scanlon Foundations, citizens favor the multicultural model and accept that the prosperity has been built by a great part on imported labor and immigrants. So obviously, as Tim, you've briefly pointed out as well, this has significant implications for rural and remote Australia. But how do we make sure that organizations like this actually not just stay viable, but also stay active and continue to advocate for the community? I'll just pan over to Erin to answer this first.
So Rati, thank you for your question. And I think just before I go into the question, I think we've learned a lot today from all the speakers on the panel. So just to Rati's question, and it's not an easy question to answer, but what I can say is that as an advocacy group, we do share that same concern in terms of funding. And I think for a lot of organizations, particularly for migrant organizations, for different code organizations, to act, and even arts and create in the creative arts area, to get funding and to get government funding is a very difficult thing, no matter which political party is in government, state and federal. And I think one thing we need to look at is also talk about leadership in terms of who are the people administering these fundings or making those decisions. And we need to start advocating more for diverse leadership. And that's one of the ways where we can really change this idea and this fear that, an organization or a group such as Rati's group is not how is it going to stay viable? Because this is a concern for many people, particularly when it comes to looking at, how they're going to sustain themselves each year. And when you have that diverse leadership, those people of diverse backgrounds who understand the situation and who are making those decisions on the table, more likely than none, they will understand a lot more in terms of what, funding different organizations such as Rati's actually need. So I think we share those concerns, but we also need to start advocating, and that's something that like what we're doing, and a lot of other groups, on the today, Diversity, Arts, Democracy and Colour, and many other groups such as us as well, are really looking at pushing for more diverse leadership, and that's the only way things will change. So hopefully that answers that question. If not, I'll try to answer it again. Thank
you, Erin. And I'll get over to Molina on Rati's second question. And this is about particularly on, I suppose, the long-term vision that you wanted to see as a community, or more specifically, a multicultural community in Australia. So the question is that advocating for an Australian Multiculturalism Act guarantees freedom of belief and culture with an overarching system of legal rights? So over to you, Molina.
Thank you, and thanks, Rati, for that important question. My personal perspective is, and others may differ from that, is I don't think a one single overarching act that deals just with this particular issue is going to be easy. It's a very tricky one, especially with different groups and different racial groups having different needs as well, and different nuances in terms of their culture or their religious laws. So I think that might be a bit tricky, but it's not one size fits all thing. You already have quite a few different acts, in whether federally or in states, that cover some of these aspects already. For me, what is really important is a human rights charter. That is because we need every law to apply equally to everyone, and that there is protection available to people. And if there's a human rights charter that sits over all legislation and cannot be abrogated in any way, that is something that will assist. Because if you have legislation, even legislation, that can be overturned anytime. But if you have a human rights charter against which every legislation needs to be measured, needs to be tested, then that to me will probably help with this situation, rather than just an act which deals with an overarching act, that Rati is suggesting. So yeah, that's my view. Others on the panel may have different views on that.
Sure. Okay, I might just quickly move on to the second questions that I open up to all the panels for this, and suddenly Molina and the rest of the panel, we can jump in and answer. Now, this is a question from Tim Usman from Brisbane. The question is about how serious the police actually take all these reports. And obviously he's referring to the reports related to racism. And will racism be changed will be charged with criminal offense with full law? So that's the question. Is there anyone from the panel who would like to answer this? So this is specifically about police. Well, obviously we don't have a police today on this panel, but we will certainly, keep that in mind and perhaps look into a future engagement and having somebody from the police force to be here. But perhaps Lynette, would you want to perhaps?
I think it's variable. We certainly get complaints from people who say the police haven't taken it seriously, and we get complaints from people who say that the police have come and one of the issues is the issue that I raised before, that they don't know who actually did this thing. So people have their cars torched or smashed, and there's no evidence that the police can actually go on to know who to arrest. So that's criminals of that kind probably tend not to be terribly open about it. But I think, you'd have to look at the sort of police reports, maybe the Police Integrity Commission, in New South Wales, the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission, those sorts of things, to see how many complaints they get about whether they've taken racist attacks seriously and what they do with those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Erin?
Yep, so I just want to add a few things to that. First, I wanted to say is that, and I will talk specifically about the Asian Australian community as a whole, there is a cultural barrier in terms of a lot of Asian Australians even reporting incidents of racism or any other incidents to the police. And a lot of that is also a cultural thing. We need to get beyond that because, it is, when you report it to the police, even if the investigation does not continue, an official record is being made and it's there. And I think that's one of the most important things, that there's a record. And if they ever go back to track trends, which a lot of the people in New South Wales Police that we've spoken to, as well as in other states, have said they are trying to track the trends as well now, because they do realize that particularly now with COVID-19 related racism, these rates of racism have increased significantly. Having spoken to some of the respondents of the survey, and I can tell you in our survey, over 80% of respondents stated that they didn't report their situation to the police. And I've spoken personally to a few of the respondents, and a lot of them have told me that because they didn't report it because they felt that their incident was not serious enough. What I've always said is that, even if it's not serious, if it's a verbal harassment, you can report it anyway, because in many cases, you'll still write some type of report with the police officer, and that will be recorded. If you don't feel comfortable going to the police, record it in our tracker/survey. But if you want to do another way, record it for yourself. Record it in some diary, type it up for yourself and keep it so you can track those trends. And when you're ready to report it, then that's when you do. But like I said, we need to get past that cultural barrier, and that cultural barrier still exists today. Thank you.
I just wanted to quickly mention, and someone had put in the comments as well about bystander intervention training. I think that's really important as well, because a lot of people are not in a situation to report to the police immediately or be able to record something or know who the person is. So if you have bystander intervention training that has been widely done by a lot of people, they would be able to stand up and assist someone who is being attacked by someone, whether on public transport or on the streets or at a workplace. So I think that is really important to sort of supplement what the police can do, or complement what the police can do. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Our next questions we have is from Susanna Ng, and this is particularly related to the availability and effectiveness of bystander anti-racism training. So I was wondering if the panel are able to comment on the effectiveness of bystander anti-racism training.
I touched upon it before, so I'll just start on it, but I'll let others speak about it, because I know of a group that has done it before. They do bystander intervention training, but mainly in relation to Islamophobia. But it's general as well. So that can be effective. I think it definitely gives you some tools on how to react in situations like that, because I may see someone who has been attacked, but I may not know how I'm meant to react, who I should report to, and what my own reaction should be to that. So I think that really helps and it does provide support to the victims.
Okay. Is there anyone wanted to add to that?
I think Lena wants to. You'll have to.
And Tim. Okay. All right.
You have to unmute them. They're not
that's
muted.
right. Yes. Tim.
Yeah, I think anything that enables allies to be more effective in being an ally is important, and taking away the burden of, as I'm sure many of the people on this call have experienced, one of the worst things about experiencing racial abuse is the sense that you are alone, and, you're having your identity and your dignity undermined. And so training that can facilitate allies safely and effectively intervening either during or after an incident can be really effective. I'd also just like, I work at a campaigning organization, so my response is always going to be personalized, individual. Things are great and they're good in the short-term moments, but everything that we're talking about here requires a political response. Racism is political, it's not an accident. And so our broader response must be political too. Racism is about power. And so that goes back to, everyday racism in the workplace, on the streets, all the way to like people like Senator Pauline Hanson saying whatever racist crap she's saying in Parliament House, or our governments are pushing forward racist policies, or the fact that more than 1.1 million people, predominantly people of colour, have been excluded from critical COVID support that no one else has been excluded from.
Lena?
I think Tim said it really well. If I could just add a little bit to say that it is the employer's responsibility as well to, in some instances, for example, in supermarkets where, people are being routinely attacked, like there needs to be kind of anti-racism training and support for, for the staff there. And I think Tim mentioned to me in a previous conversation that they also run resilience training for people as well. So I do think that there's a role for training and kind of developing those strategies, but I also agree with Tim that this is a systemic and structural thing. It isn't just about individuals learning to be nice to each other. It's actually something that it's incredible to kind of see that the first act of Parliament was actually an act that made it illegal for people from the Asian and African continents to migrate to Australia, that effectively, was a racist act, and that it's quite easy and quite quick to have instances like this where, and to evoke stuff that creates racism in society. And that's you know, because I feel like it's always dormant and it's always there. It's never, you know, it hasn't really properly been dealt with. Yeah, so I think that part of it is that, and we tend to be a little bit skeptical of some of the kinds of training, because sometimes they are really very much about focusing on the individual and not focusing on the systems. And we need to kind of have changes to systems and the way that they're operating in order for things to really change. Also, I know this is off topic, but I remembered a great example of Indirect, which is when Chinese Australians came back to Australia during COVID. They were put in detention centres. They were isolated in detention centres when predominantly non-Chinese and non-Asian people came back via the cruise ships. They were put in 5-star accommodation. I would say that's a great example of indirect discrimination.
Lynette, do you have any comments?
That's actually pretty direct.
I was going to say that.
I think the previous example you gave about swimming carnivals in Ramadan was perfect. That was really good.
I'm going to be up all night thinking about indirect examples.
I remember, I know a good example is I do a lot of work in sport, not letting women, or not letting people wear what they want to wear and forcing them to wear something that is not suitable to their particular customs or religion is indirect discrimination, because it prevents them access to the sport. So
yeah, if you the uniform, that's the uniform, and it can't be varied. Yeah, that would probably be indirect. Yep.
It's very interesting, and particularly come back to the question about training, because it makes me think that what's going on in our education system. I mean, given that we're talking about having a training, for example, training for employers to train employees on, what multiculturalism is about and what is racism, these sort of things. But isn't that something that we should embed in our education system rather than, having a separate training program for these sort of things?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize the importance of unconscious bias training as well. It's not as drastic as bystander intervention, but unconscious bias training is really important for all organizations to undertake because that helps in decision making that avoids discrimination.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously, with the involvement of international students in these particular conversations, and Australia obviously being, one of the study destinations in the world that welcomes many international students. In fact, last year alone, in 2019, the statistics shows that there are more than 750,000 international students in Australia. So obviously, I guess the dilemma on the other side of things is that, government universities go out there and say that, look, racism, a racial attack, these are something that is more isolated incident. It's not something that is, that is very something to we worry about in Australia. But at the same time, we shouldn't stop talking about it and in fact taking action about it, isn't it? Because if we don't empower our community, particularly international students, to take action on particular matter like this, how are we going to address this particular concern? Right?
So Thomson, I'll say a few words on that. Yeah. So what I do want to say is that I don't believe that we should even use the term isolated incidents of racism, because one incident is one too many incident. And one thing we need to also remember is that as people of colour, as Indigenous Australians, people of colour, Asian Australians, all of us in Australia and in the West, we are seen as minority communities. And when you are a minority, doesn't matter whether you're a citizen, you're born in Australia, you're a permanent resident, or you're an international student, at the end of the day, you'll always be seen differently. And that's one thing we need to also recognize. It's not something to disempower people. but it's more to be aware that racism is a major issue. And one of the reasons why it is a major issue is because our leaders and the government and leaders of all political, different political parties, as well as the tabloid media, have enabled this racism to occur. And I know we do have a lot of international students as participants, and international students have been the target of racism, and not just because of COVID-19. Even before that, we've seen a lot of attacks. So what can be done about this? One thing I can say is that we cannot avoid racism because it can happen anywhere, but what we can do is to ensure that we have strong support networks around us, whether if that's a student group, whether that's your friends or things like that. And I think to have that support is really important. And obviously one of the reasons why we are also doing webinar series like this is to tell people that groups like all of us who are on the speaker panel today are also there for people to reach out to. I've read a comment, for example, from I think Kumiko, who mentioned that it is very difficult to approach the police, and and I totally agree with that. And so that's why, to have support networks that you can go and ask, people to go with you if you need to report it. And if you don't need, and if it's something that you don't want to report, to have somebody to talk to is actually really important. And then to have advocacy groups like ours and the others on the speaking panel to ensure that this issue is kept in the mainstream, and that places like the tabloid media, a good example is, I think it was the Herald Sun, who pretty much kind of at the end of January to early February, pretty much just labeled this, big headline calling it the Chinese virus, and then other paper headlines saying, Chinese kids stay home. So that is direct racism, because it's already, directing at a particular group of people. And sadly, there's still a lot of people in Australia who are quite ignorant, or, a lot of them, majority of them would be ignorant, but there are a lot who also hold a lot of racist intentions. And now at this moment in time, it's just giving them an excuse to act on their racism. And so international student, citizen, permanent resident, whatever you are, we all need to be aware of our surroundings. And that's why I said, having a network of support, particularly if you're an international student, you're a lot of the time you're alone, and people like Thomson, you'd know how all that feels, you're by yourself, and then you need to find your own community, where you say, so if you can, find that community. If not, reach out to groups like ours and other groups out there, to help you find that community. That's what, we're all there for.
And thank you so much, Erin. That's spot on. I think that also accessing services that that can also provide support as well. Then there are services, and there are a lot of services that are targeted to people from, non-white migrants specifically, that are set up for that. And we've put something on our website, and I'm sure AAA has something on theirs as well, with some of those organisations and connections to them. But one of the reasons we do what we do at Diversity Arts is that we really believe that the arts, and whether it be filmmaking, interviews, podcasts, performance, has the power to really challenge a lot of narratives, and also to give artists and creatives the opportunity to have their own narrative. And in this, Asian people are not just victims, they're also, they're also powerful kind of agents of change. They've got their own stories and narratives and lives. And so one of our artists, Maria Tran, had an experience at a supermarket, for example, where she had a racist incident and was called coronavirus. So she decided to go back to the supermarket dressed as a ninja. She's actually a martial artist and has acted in these, has worked in Vietnam and in China in martial arts movies. So, because not many, and she decided to take photos of herself and create a meme as a kind of way of, I guess, adding humour to it, but also kind of pushing back against that narrative. She also then did an interview with two of the young women in Sydney, in Marrickville, who were racially abused because of COVID. And and then has done a really nice interview that she's put online. And one of the things that we're wanting to do with Asian Australian Alliance and Democracy in Colour is actually to commission a lot of artists and creatives to create stories on their own terms, in their own voices, responding to the COVID stuff. And I think that's also a way to bring people into the conversation, you know, and to kind of disrupt the narrative that that racist kind of narrative.
Yeah, look, I mean, interesting points, because that, you know, the other thing I have in mind is that we talk about stakeholders in the beginning of this webinar. So I guess, are we doing enough as a community, whether you're a government or you're education providers or you're a business entity, are we doing enough to raise awareness, not just about this particular issue, but, you know, where do we get support from, and the resources and information that people would need to know? Because I've seen comments from our group chat, you know, and obviously there are comments that says that people don't even know there's a legislation about, you know, whether it is on the federal level or state level. So I guess a quick comments, if I can get from, you know, our panelists, are we doing enough? And if not, you know, what can we do in this particular matter?
I'm happy to kind of say a few words on that. So, look, I think one thing we need to recognize, and I think, you know, Yao Tong made a good comment, is that Australia, you know, we don't have a long history. You know, when I say long, I mean, like, you know, I'm talking about Asian Australians, you know, that we don't have that long history of, you know, fights against anti-racism. I think the only, you know, communities I can think of who have done a lot of work in that area throughout history are Indigenous Australians, who have been doing that for a really long time. A lot of other communities, you know, are starting to do it now. You know, if you look at countries like US and Canada, they've been doing that for a really long time. Different communities, you know, African Americans, you know, in the US, you know, with the civil rights movement, and even, you know, Black Lives Matter, a lot of work they're doing now. And if you, and I think that's one thing we need to recognize, is that a lot of that work from other communities, we are doing it, and it's getting there. But a lot, and, you know, there's always a lot more work that needs to be done in that area. And I think, you know, we're trying to do it. A lot of the groups in this speaker panel are trying to do it, and a lot of groups who are not on this speaker panel are trying to do that work now. And I know that for a lot of people, and you know, and I've seen in the comments, it's very difficult for people to know who to contact when they're looking for support and when they're wanting that support. And hopefully, you know, through doing things like this, we can start getting that word out. And you know, stuff that we're doing with Democracy in Colour and Diversity Arts Australia, with the, you know, website, with the creative sharing stories, but also on our Asian Australian Alliance page, we're going to start doing a resource page on our website, so that people can access different resources and have contacts of people that they can actually contact if they're going through, you know, different situations and they need that support. And I think we just need to continually do that. And I know a lot of government departments are also now trying to do that as well. So the more people doing it, the better, I'd say. And I think for a lot of the different communities, it's starting now, but more needs to be done for sure.
I just wanted to add to what Erin was saying as well. I think the coordinated effort is a part of it is really important, because there's a lot of work being done by different entities, by individuals, by groups, and even the government and police. But to bring it all together is really important, because you will have a stronger voice if you are together, and you have the backing of the government and the police and other organizations that have are decision makers as well. And the other issue, I think, is of resourcing as well, because a lot of that work is dependent on the resourcing, the funding. And the funding, I feel, for multicultural activities, or you can call it, these kind of activities, goes to the wrong things. It goes to always talking about how, you know, food and dresses and culture, which is important, but it is those are the things that the communities can invest in themselves. They have the resources to do that. The government needs to invest in in advocacy issues that are going to change this system, have systemic effect in our community, the things that will remove these biases, and I don't see the funding usually going towards those kind of efforts or organizations.
Thank you,
And
Molina.
there's power in us connecting and uniting and working together around these issues, and also kind of economic power as well in terms of not having resources and funding. So yeah, and actually I started getting involved in anti-racism work when I was at university and connected with other students who were not all Arabs, but were from all different backgrounds, but we all had in common our experiences of racism and racial discrimination. So yeah, I feel like students are really well placed to make those connections as well and work together to kind of, you know, advocate for change.
Thank you. Our next question is, was actually one of the earliest person who asked the question in our forum, and this is from Jane Anderson, and this is specifically about what has happened for the last couple of days. Now, Lowy Institute forum yesterday comprised international journalists, and one question which the journalists refuted was that negative media about China could lead to racism. So comments and thoughts from the panel on this.
Thomson, can you repeat that last line that you mentioned? I kind of just had some.
Yeah. So so this is what happened was, you know, it happened in Canberra, where there's a comment or a statement made by the Chinese ambassador. So the question is, could this particular negative media or negative publicity about China lead to racism?
Yes, so I'm happy to answer that. The answer is yes, and I'll explain why. And how I explain to people is that there is nothing wrong with people talking about the concerns over the growth and influence of China. But if you are going to talk about this topic, you need to talk about it in a broader level. You know, talk about it, you know, with the growing influence of the US and of Europe and other Western nations. But the debates and the angle that Australian debate has taken on this topic is just focused on China. And because a lot of people generally fear the unknown, and a lot of people are not sure what they expect from China, and that's why the racism is happening. Not that I'm excusing the racism, because I'm saying that the current debate over this topic does feel anti-Chinese, anti-Asian sentiments, and that's because being Chinese, you know, if I might like myself being Chinese origin or being any Asian origin, you know, you are already categorized in Australia to fit in certain categories. And the negative media over China is just only fuels that hate, and it normalizes the racist behavior towards anybody's Chinese, because we are a visible community. And then it's easy for people just to look at anybody who has black hair and associate them for being from China or being suspicious. And that's why the debate hasn't been going the way it should be. It hasn't been a holistic approach in terms of talking about it more broadly. It's just focused on one particular country and one particular group. And unfortunately, this debate has not done well in terms of talking about the Chinese government and talking about Chinese people as a whole. It's conflated this into one big thing. And the people that receive the racial backlash are people who are Asian or Chinese Australians, or people Chinese or Asians in Australia. And the other thing that the media has done, and I'm going to steal this from what Jason Yatsen Lee has said on Q&A quite a while ago. There is good China and there is bad China. The Western media and the Australian media, you know, is really, particularly the tabloid media is good at talking about the bad China. You know, it's same as we talk about US, you know, a lot of the good stuff is always spoken about the US as opposed to the bad stuff. When it comes to China, it's the bad stuff that gets more media attention than the good stuff that is happening. And what can be done about media stuff is that, you know, people can actually, you know, we've submitted complaints to the national, the National Press Gallery, as well as some of the unions, the media, I think MEAA, we've actually submitted a complaint for a Sydney Morning Herald article which talked about Chinese businesses shipping supplies to China. And this was back when, Wuhan was the center of the pandemic. And that was only printed in March. So, we've already kind of lodged a complaint with the union on that. So I guess my long discussion on this topic is that the current discussion does feel anti-Chinese, anti-Asian sentiment. It hasn't been dealt with properly. It hasn't been discussed in a broader level. It's just highlighted one particular country and conflated that with one particular group of people. And I think that's where the big problem is. And that's why I said at the beginning, COVID-19 related racism is a symptom of the bigger problem. Thank you.
And just to add to Erin's comments, I think we all know that this country has a very long history of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiments. It's a very long history of xenophobia. As Lena mentioned, the first piece of legislation passed post-Federation, what is now known as the White Australia Policy, was explicitly designed to prevent Chinese migration during the gold rush. And 100 years later, we now have a very feverish political discourse that invokes fear of anything Chinese, whether that's immigration or technology or property ownership or anything. And this was before COVID-19. And obviously, because of the racialized narrative around COVID-19, it's exacerbated that. But it certainly, wasn't lacking in the before times, before 2020.
Okay. So look, that brings us to the last question of our webinar session today. And this question is, I think is quite relevant to many people because this is more on a micro scales, on a personal scale. So the question to all the panelists would be, what can people do when they are in a situation when they're going against a racist authority figure? And sometimes, obviously, it is hard to judge, whether it is, again, racism or not. But if racism is the rationale behind the behavior of the particular authority, but what can people do in regards to that?
Well, I think it's really important for people to clarify with whatever, if it's a decision maker, to ask for reasons why the decision's been made. Obviously you can be given the official reasons, but we get complaints certainly from people who have a reason, but it's pretty easy to sort of poke holes in it because you can find material that has been taken into consideration that isn't really the reason that you're being given. So I think it's to get as much evidence as possible if you want to make a complaint, and also get some good legal advice, so that when you make a complaint that you've got a really good case. I'd encourage people to take it. We do see situations where people have been treated unfairly on the basis of their race, and authorities back down. So the real estate agent has backed down, the employer has backed down because the racism's been called out.
And just on that note, Lynette, what happened, because obviously organizations, if not all, many of them will have their own internal process, right? So the question of going through the internal grievances process versus, us reporting this straight to the organization like the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination. So I guess the dilemma would always be there. And also, the fact that there might be consequences where people may lose the job after doing that.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
Sure. So, sometimes people have gone through. Sorry. Someone else is talking.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So I was just going to say, look, sometimes people have gone through an internal grievance, sometimes they haven't. We don't require them to do that. I absolutely appreciate that it is difficult for people because, usually the person who's made the most decision is a more powerful person. They're the employer or whatever. There are avenues for people to go to the tribunal to get interim orders to stop termination of employment. People can go to NCAT, the tribunal, to stop being evicted. And we have been involved in cases like that. But, I'm not going to pretend that, everyone has a happy outcome. or that it's an easy process in any way whatsoever. But it's certainly not a very formal process. We don't require people to have, you know, statements, signed statements or anything like that. And at the very least, it's probably a good start to ring our inquiry service and just ask and get some good tips about where they can get support, where they can get free legal advice, and other avenues that they might be able to take to seek redress.
Thank you, Lynette. Is there any final comments or remarks that the panelists wanted to say before I call it an off for this?
I do want to say one quick thing, nothing related to the questions, but I do want to have a special mention of Adri Lozano, who's been our great doing the admin really well, and, you know, making sure everyone's questions and comments are getting noticed. So I know I can always see her head popping down looking at the chat section. So we want to give a special mention to her and her work with us at AAA as well, and also our other people at AAA who are actually participants in this session today.
And to add to that, I think from all of us, a massive thank you to the Asian Australian Alliance for that really important survey, that massive survey that is so important to document this and have a record of this. Thank you, Erin, and all of your team.
Thank you.
Definitely. I'd second that. And I think my final comment would just be on the importance of solidarity, that we've talked a lot about racism over the course of this discussion, but, you know, we cannot have racial justice in this country unless it's rooted in First Nations justice. Every issue that we want to talk about is disproportionately experienced by First Nations people, and I think it's incumbent on us. We might be, you know, a more explicit target right now, but this is a moment and it will pass. And for the last 230 years under the construct that is Australia, the target has always been First Nations people. So it's essential that as people of colour, we don't view ourselves as a homogenous block, and we understand that different folks within our communities experience different levels of privilege and discrimination. And then actually, for the most part, we're actually doing okay. And we saw some comments in the chat around, you know, the idea of assimilation and the idea of becoming this model minority. And we need to fight that as much as we can, because we can never win. You know, assimilating to whiteness is not the goal. The goal is to be able to be seen with dignity as ourselves in our own communities, with our own cultures. And we can never achieve that unless we link arms in solidarity with all people of colour, with our Black brothers and sisters and comrades, with our First Nations comrades, and every other community out there. So we think in solidarity.
And we definitely I definitely second what Tim said. I think that solidarity is extremely important. So yeah, you know, this is a time, particularly now more than ever, where we should be looking at what solidarity looks like and be in solidarity with other people of colour and Indigenous Australians. And I'd like to give a quick special mention that, you know, we you know, at AAA particularly, we like to thank a lot of the Indigenous communities and individuals who have messaged us and told them that they're talking about the COVID-19 related racism with their own communities and standing in solidarity with us at this time. And for us as Asian Australians, particularly, this is a really big learning curve for us as well. Like, you know, second what Tim said, in terms of us uniting and standing in solidarity with other groups as well.
And thanks, Tim and Erin, everyone, and for this fabulous discussion. And I just wanted to say that to everyone, just speak out. Let's not keep silent. That's really important. There needs to be solidarity, but we also need to speak out. If we stay quiet, we will be taken advantage of. So everyone on this group who's listening today, please stand up to others, yourself, just speak up. Thank you.
Lena and Lynette.
If you're a creative out there, if you're an artist or creative, keep an eye out for the campaign that AAA and Diversity Arts and Democracy in Colour are going to run, and speak out not only through legal channels, but also through making art, writing pieces, or creating, you know, films or whatever it might be.
Lynette, any final thoughts, questions, comments?
Just, you know, endorse everything everyone said.
Thank you so much. And please join me to thank everyone again for these amazing discussions and the time, and of course to all the participants who have joined us today. So thank you so much. And if we are organizing future projects and webinars, and if you'd like to get engaged with us, certainly follow us on Facebook, our website, and also at the social media form as well. So thank you and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.